Broadside Books and Harper Audio present No Trade is Free, Changing Course, Taking on China, and Helping America's Workers by Robert Lighthizer. Read by Charles Constant. A note before we begin. Don't forget to download the accompanying enhancement PDF from your audiobook provider, or go directly to www.harpercollins.com/pages/No Trade is Free. It contains charts and notes and will be referred to throughout as the enhancement. To Bob and Claire, and to every American worker who makes our country great. When the facts change, I change my mind. What do you do, sir? Attributed to John Maynard Keynes. Failure is not fatal, but failure to change might be. John Wooden. Introduction. In Washington, D.C., it was an overcast day on June 9, 2010, and, by local standards, on the cool side. 70 degrees is a comfortable temperature there in the summer. I was in a taxi on my way to the Dirksen Senate Office Building to testify before the U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission. This was a group of 12 men and women appointed by the bipartisan congressional leadership and tasked with assessing U.S. relations with China. By the time my panel began, the temperature had risen a bit and it had started to rain. I thought, perfect. Depressing report on a depressing day. I was appearing on a panel with a couple other trade law experts. A group from Congress, including Senators Lindsey Graham of South Carolina and Chuck Schumer of New York, was on right before us. My task for the commission was to evaluate the impacts of China's joining the World Trade Organization, WTO, 10 years on. The commission invited me to speak because by that point I was well known in Washington circles as a skeptic, not only of trade relations with China, but also of the international trade system writ large. I had been a trade lawyer for more than 30 years, working for the U.S. Senate, in the Reagan administration, and in private law practice, representing American manufacturers in front of administrative agencies and courts. By the time of the hearings in 2010, I was one of a small handful of Washington commentators willing to openly argue against the negative effects of Washington's one-sided free trade agenda. My testimony on American trade relations with China that day was 35 single-spaced pages. It showed in great detail what a disaster the 2000 decision to grant China Most Favored Nation, MFN, status had been for America, and particularly for our workers. It listed all the commitments that China had made back then, and showed how they hadn't kept them, presented the economic calamity that these 10 years had been for us, and highlighted the giddy pronouncements that our politicians had made, including President Clinton, Republican presidential candidate George W. Bush, and many leaders in Congress. The testimony quoted their unparalleled optimism. This was a 100-0 deal, proclaimed then President Clinton. And then my testimony gave the butcher's bill. We had lost millions of jobs and thousands of factories while wages had stagnated. This ultimate concession to communist leaders, free trade, and multinational corporations had been an unmitigated disaster for working people. Finally, I predicted it was only going to get worse for our workers if we stayed on the same course, and I made specific policy recommendations, including imposing tariffs on Chinese imports to correct the problem. After the hearing, 2 of the commissioners told me it was the most important testimony they had heard in their tenure. But little to nothing changed over the following half-decade. My warnings over China went largely unheeded, just as though they had throughout the 1990s when I editorialized and fought against allowing China to join the WTO, the ratification of the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, and Washington's radical free trade agenda. Well before 2010, it was clear to me that the issue of American trade relations with China was not an isolated problem, but was instead emblematic of larger issues in U.S. trade policy. The political establishments of both the Republican and Democratic parties, under the influence of multinational corporations and importers, were unwilling or unable to recognize their mistakes. Instead, they
Sample complete. Ready to continue?